My name is Rich Jones, and this is Podcast Movement. So our podcast is called Paychecks and Bounces, so it's all about helping millennials make money, save money, and get out of debt. We try to make sure that we keep it super relatable, super light, super fun. We don't purport to be experts. It's essentially all about the mistakes that we've made, the experiences that we've had, and that's really why listeners come to check us out. They don't feel like someone's talking down to them, they feel like it's somebody who's right there with them. So previously I was a blogger since 2008, and then around 2013 I realized I wanted to transition to a different medium. And I started looking at podcasting, I started exploring different shows that were out there, and I was also thinking to myself that what would take me 2 hours to write, I could probably say in about 5 minutes. What I did not realize was that the whole production side of podcasting would be the equivalent of the amount of time that it took me to write an article, but it was also a lot more fun. I have not always had a passion for finance, and that was also another reason I started looking into podcasts in 2013, because my priorities in life had changed a bit. So part of it was getting into debt and knowing that I wanted to get out. That lack of security is really what triggered me to start getting my stuff together. And there was a period of time where I'd cut the debt down and then I'd feel good about it and build that debt right back up again. And I actually think the podcast and actually some of the folks that we have spoken to have helped me cure some of my debt issues. I actually became 100% debt free in the past couple of years. I think of myself in the audience. And so whenever we're recording an episode or whenever I do anything really, there is a particular person that I have in mind. It looks very much like myself. They're struggling with probably some of the same things that I struggled with. And it sounds cliche, but not wanting that person to feel like they're alone. For them being able to see that someone has done this, someone has been able to get out of debt, someone has been able to take this professional path, someone has been able to make these decisions to get to where they are today, despite all the other things that have happened. Like for example, we talk a lot about therapy on the podcast, which is something that a lot of men in particular don't want to talk about publicly. But that's a big part of the story for me. I had a week where my uncle passed away, and then my uncle's funeral was on the same day as my deceased dad's birthday. And then that same day that the funeral happened, a friend jumped in front of a train and committed suicide. Now, if I didn't have a therapist at that time, I don't know what I would have done with myself. These are things that happen, and it's how you respond to these things that really matter. The mental is a huge part of personal finance. The mental and the emotional are huge parts of it. So I tend to be someone who's an emotional spender, and you can tell when my life is going really well, and you can tell when things are really a struggle and when I'm really stressed, because you see my spending peak. So I've talked on the podcast about being an introvert, but I don't think people actually understand how introverted I truly am. So when I come to conferences and I speak on stage and I have a podcast where part of what my job on that show, it's to talk. And that's all part of it, because these are things that years ago I wouldn't have done. I remember the first time I came to Podcast Movement and I was on this, everything is so new and I'm not an expert yet. And the second year is like, I'm not ready to speak, I still need to know more. And then I saw people who were coming to the conference for the first time who had less experience on stage speaking. And that was kind of a light bulb moment for me, where it was kind of like, you know what, if they're doing it, I can do it. And so I also know that there's an opportunity for me to have that same impact, which is why I talk about being introverted. It's overcoming that and then coming off a stage and having conversations and making people feel good. My podcast is not where it is without coming to Podcast Movement. I've built relationships here, I've made friends here. There are folks that I'm in a mastermind group with that are from Podcast Movement. I've spoken at Podcast Movement multiple times. It's also afforded me the opportunity to speak at a conference in Las Vegas. I wouldn't know about the FinCon community, which is on the personal finance side of things, without Podcast Movement. I wouldn't have spoken at that conference without Podcast Movement. I know for a fact that my podcast right now would not be a finalist for Podcast of the Year at the FinCon conference or Blog of the Year if I hadn't come into the Podcast Movement community. It's not so much what happens in the sessions, it's the conversations that you have in the hallway. It's the conversations that you may have before a session starts, where you're sitting next to someone and you realize that you're doing something similar, or that there's a way for you to help each other out. So I always want to remind people to get started and figure it out along the way, and that's part of why we talk about the mistakes that we've made, because it has been a journey. And you can't have a journey if you never get started. So that's been a big thing for me, and to think, had I wasted an additional 6 months, 8 months trying to collect information, I may have ended up not getting started with podcasting at all. And then I'd be in a completely different situation than where I am today, and not in a position where I've been able to help thousands of millennials in terms of their personal finances and their careers.